When did you finally realize that the one person everyone told you to stay away from, the one they said was toxic, controlling, or bitter, was actually the only one who saw the truth all along and was desperately trying to protect you while everyone else was leading you straight into disaster? I was 12 when Marcus became our next-door neighbor. Within hours, the entire community was abuzz with hushed conversations. "That's the man from the news," Mrs. Henderson murmured, clutching her pearls as if they offered some magical shield against the evil she envisioned. "The one who went to prison," my mother added, her grip tightening on my arm that first evening as I prepared to ride my bike. Her fingers pressed into my skin, leaving marks that lingered until morning. "Stay away from that house," she commanded, her voice sharp with an unfamiliar fear. "That man is dangerous. He harmed children." I longed to ask how she knew, what precisely he had done, or why such a perilous individual was permitted to reside in our quiet neighborhood. However, the resolute look in her eyes silenced me. This topic was not open for discussion. For weeks, I observed him from my bedroom window. He kept to himself, tending a small, surprisingly beautiful garden. Tomatoes and sunflowers grew in neat rows, each with its own tiny, handwritten label. He never met anyone's gaze, never returned away from passing children. When youngsters on bicycles appeared, parents would instantly call them back inside, their voices laced with panic. Even the mail carrier avoided his driveway, tossing packages from the sidewalk and hurrying away as though the property itself were tainted. Mrs. Patterson, from across the street, initiated a phone tree, alerting every parent whenever Marcus left his home. "He's heading toward the school," she would whisper into the receiver. "Best keep the children indoors today." The Homeowners Association convened an urgent meeting to address the situation. I wasn't meant to know, but I overheard my mother on the phone with Mrs. Chun, their voices low and laced with concern. "We've contacted legal counsel," Mom stated. "There must be a way to have him removed." Yet, it seemed there wasn't. Marcus had completed his sentence, whatever the offense, and possessed every legal right to reside where he chose, even if that meant living adjacent to families with young ones. But I began to notice subtle details that others overlooked, small things that made me question the adult narrative. For instance, his porch light remained on until precisely 4:15 p.m. every weekday, the exact moment I returned from school, despite his night shifts at the warehouse. I would catch him watching from his kitchen window as I approached our driveway, and only then would the light extinguish. Or how he would suddenly emerge to water his plants whenever the Parker boys trailed me down our street, and they would inexplicably choose an alternate route home. Initially, I dismissed it as coincidence, but it occurred too frequently to be random. His curtains would often twitch as I walked by, as if he were maintaining vigilance, not in a sinister way, but more like a protective sentinel checking for threats. I started to meticulously track his routine. Each morning at 7:30 a.m. sharp, he would depart for his night shift at Morrison's warehouse, clad in a simple blue uniform with his name stitched onto the pocket. He drove a worn Honda Civic that appeared to have seen better decades. He would return at 6 a.m., park in his driveway, and go straight inside without glancing around. On weekends, he would work in his garden, but the instant children appeared outdoors, he would gather his tools and retreat indoors. If a child's ball landed in his yard, he would toss it back over the fence without stepping outside. When Girl Scouts came selling cookies, he would leave money in an envelope taped to his door, with a note instructing them to keep the change. It was as if he deliberately sought invisibility. Mrs. Henderson organized what she termed safety patrols, parents taking turns monitoring Marcus's house. They meticulously recorded his comings and goings, who visited him, no one ever did, and what packages he received. "We must document everything," she declared at the next homeowners meeting, "in case something occurs." What struck me, however, was Marcus's diligent effort to provide them with nothing to document. He never lingered outside, never engaged neighbors unless directly addressed, and even then, his replies were concise and courteous. He never played music loudly enough to be heard, never hosted parties or visitors. If he were indeed a predator, he was the most reclusive one I had ever encountered. One October evening, I was walking home late from the library when 3 older boys cornered me behind a gas station. Jake Morrison and his friends, the same ones who had been making my life miserable since middle school began. "Look what we have here," Jake sneered, shoving me against the brick wall hard enough to scrape my shoulders. Little bookworm, all alone. Jake was the type of kid who had been held back twice and was already shaving in 7th grade. His friends, Tyler and Brett, were smaller but possessed a dangerous, pack-animal meanness. They rummaged through my backpack, laughing as my books scattered across the grimy pavement. One of them snatched my math homework, the assignment I had spent 3 hours perfecting, and tore it in half. Another kicked my water bottle, sending it rolling into the gutter where it landed in a puddle that reeked of rotting food. "Please," I pleaded, hating the tremor in my voice. "Just leave me alone." "Ah, little baby's going to cry," Jake taunted, pushing me harder against the wall. The rough brick caught my jacket, tearing a hole near the shoulder. "Maybe we should teach you some manners. Show you what happens to freaks who think they're better than everyone else." Tyler pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is going to be great," he chuckled. "We can put it online, show everyone what a loser you are." I closed my eyes, wishing I could vanish. My mother would be furious about me coming home late. The librarian had warned us about walking alone after dark. I should have called for a ride, asked someone to walk with me, done anything but put myself in this predicament. That's when Marcus appeared. He didn't run, or shout, or make a dramatic entrance. He simply emerged from behind the dumpster, where he must have been taking out trash from the Chinese restaurant, and asked calmly, "Problem here?" His voice was composed, almost conversational, yet something about it made the hairs on my arms prickle. He wasn't a large man, perhaps average height, with a lean build, the kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. But the way he stood, the way he regarded the boys without blinking, suggested someone you truly did not want to provoke. The boys looked up, and I watched recognition flash across their faces. Jake's arrogant grin vanished instantly. His friends recoiled, suddenly appearing very young and very frightened. "No problem, mister," Jake stammered, his voice utterly different from the confident bully tone he had been using moments earlier. "We were just leaving." "Leaving," Marcus reiterated, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that unnerved even me. "Yeah," Tyler quickly agreed, stuffing his phone back into his pocket. "We were just leaving." Within seconds, all three were gone, leaving my belongings scattered everywhere and me standing there, trembling. Marcus knelt and helped me gather my books. Up close, I could discern the profound sadness in his eyes, lines around them that spoke of sleepless nights and enduring sorrow. His hands were gentle as he smoothed the pages of my torn notebook, careful not to worsen the damage. "You okay?" he inquired, handing me my backpack. I nodded, my voice unreliable. "They hurt you." I shook my head. The brick wall had scraped my shoulders, but that was nothing compared to what might have transpired had he not intervened. "Good." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "You should get home. It's getting dark." "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded but offered no smile, simply turned and walked back toward the dumpster, his shoulders hunched as if burdened by the weight of the world. I arrived home just as my mother was preparing dinner. One look at my torn jacket and scraped hands, and she immediately shifted into protective parent mode. "What happened? Are you hurt? Where have you been?" I recounted staying late at the library, the boys cornering me, and someone scaring them away. I omitted mentioning who that someone was. "This is precisely why I don't want you walking alone after dark," she said, dabbing antiseptic on my scraped palms. "There are dangerous people out there." The irony was not lost on me. The dangerous person everyone had warned me about had just rescued me from genuine peril. The next day, my mother was waiting when I returned from school, her face pale with fury. I knew instantly that someone had seen me with Marcus. "Mrs. Chen saw you talking to him," she declared, her voice trembling with a blend of fear and anger. "I specifically told you to stay away from that monster." "But Mom, he just helped me." "Don't you dare defend him," she snapped, and I was stunned by the venom in her voice. My mother rarely raised her voice, never used that tone with me. "Do you have any idea what kind of man he is? What he did to children before he went to prison?" I attempted to explain about the bullies, how Marcus had simply been taking out trash and happened to be there, how he had never truly spoken to me. But my mother wasn't listening. She was already grabbing her keys. "We're going to see Pastor Williams," she announced, "right now." The drive to the church was silent and fraught with tension. My mother's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and she kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror as if I might disappear. Pastor Williams met us in his office, adorned with crosses of every size and material, family photographs displaying 3 generations of smiling faces, and motivational posters featuring Bible verses in flowing script. He was a kind man in his 60s who had baptized me as a baby and always treated me like one of his own grandchildren. But today, his expression was solemn as he sat me down and spoke in careful, measured words about dangerous individuals and their methods. "Predators are cunning, Emma," he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped on his desk. "They don't resemble the monsters in films. They appear as friendly neighbors, helpful teachers, respected community members. They feign kindness to gain children's trust." He produced a pamphlet from his desk drawer, one of those educational materials with images of smiling adults interacting with children, designed to teach kids about stranger danger. "They study children's routines," he continued, pointing to illustrations that suddenly seemed more ominous than instructive. "They learn their vulnerabilities, find ways to appear helpful. They position themselves as rescuers so children will trust them." "But he didn't offer me anything," I protested. "He just scared away some bullies and told me to go home." Pastor Williams nodded gravely, as if this was precisely what he had anticipated me saying. "That's exactly what I'm referring to. He positioned himself as your rescuer so you would feel grateful to him, trust him. Next time, he might offer to walk you home for safety, then perhaps invite you inside for a snack or to use the restroom." He opened the pamphlet to a page illustrating the progression of predatory behavior, the gradual escalation from helpful stranger to perilous situation. "That's how these men operate, sweetheart. They are patient. They build relationships slowly. They make children feel special, chosen, protected." My mother squeezed my shoulder, her grip tight enough to sting. "This is why you need to report any contact immediately, before you become his next victim." I nodded and promised to keep my distance, but something didn't quite align in my 12-year-old mind. If Marcus was truly seeking victims, why did he so assiduously avoid children? I had been observing him for weeks and had never witnessed him attempt to engage any child in the neighborhood. When the elementary school bus stopped at our corner each morning, he would retreat inside his house until it departed. When parents walked by with strollers, he would turn away or find something to occupy himself in his backyard. If children's toys ended up in his yard, he would toss them back over the fence without stepping outside. For someone supposedly targeting children, he certainly went to great lengths to avoid them. Over the subsequent weeks, I became fixated on observing Marcus, not because I wished to speak with him. My mother had made her stance on that unequivocally clear, but because I sought to comprehend the discrepancy between what the adults were telling me and what I was witnessing with my own eyes. I began keeping a notebook, meticulously documenting everything I observed. My scientific approach to the situation would have earned my science teacher's admiration had I been studying anything other than our neighbor's daily routine. Every morning at 7:30 a.m. precisely, he would depart for his night shift at Morrison's warehouse, dressed in that identical blue uniform with Marcus embroidered on the pocket. The warehouse was on the opposite side of town, beyond the industrial district where most children never ventured. He would return at 6 a.m., looking weary, park his dilapidated Honda in the driveway, and proceed directly inside without looking around or lingering. On weekends, he would tend his garden, and it was here that his behavior became truly intriguing. He had positioned his small vegetable plot to afford a clear view of the bus stop, where elementary school children waited each morning, but also so he could quickly withdraw if any of them approached. I watched him plant tomatoes, sunflowers, green beans, and herbs in neat rows with small, handwritten labels. His garden was exquisite, clearly the work of someone who genuinely cared about cultivation. Yet, the moment children appeared outside, he would pack up his tools and disappear indoors. It was beginning to feel less like predatory behavior and more like a form of safeguarding. One Saturday morning, I decided to test my hypothesis. Instead of remaining indoors as my mother preferred, I sat on our front porch with a book, clearly visible from Marcus's yard. Sure enough, within minutes of settling into the porch swing, I saw his curtains twitch. But he did not emerge, did not attempt to speak to me, did not even wave. Instead, he remained at his window, and I realized he was observing the street. When an unfamiliar white van drove slowly past our house, Marcus moved to a different window to keep it in sight. When it turned around and returned, he stepped onto his porch. The van continued driving, But Marcus remained outside for another 10 minutes, watching. When I informed my mother about the van, she was immediately concerned. What kind of van did you see? Who was driving? But when I mentioned that Marcus had also been watching it, her expression shifted. He was probably the one driving it earlier, she said dismissively. Predators often case neighborhoods, looking for opportunities. That didn't make sense to me. If Marcus was casing our neighborhood, why would he then stand on his porch to deter himself? I began to pay closer attention to the details my mother and other adults seemed to overlook or dismiss. For example, how Marcus had installed motion sensor lights around his property, not solely for his own protection, but positioned to illuminate the street in front of our house and the Chin's house next door. How he had started parking his car in his driveway instead of his garage, creating a clearer line of sight to the street. How he had trimmed the hedge between our properties so it wouldn't obstruct his view of our front door. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought he was establishing a security system to protect the neighborhood. One afternoon, I resolved to test my theory more directly. Instead of walking straight home from school, I took a detour through Riverside Park, where older kids sometimes congregated, smoking cigarettes and causing mischief. It was a risky move. My mother had explicitly forbidden me from going there alone, but I needed to confirm my suspicions. Indeed, Jake Morrison and his crew were there, sprawled on the picnic tables near the basketball court. They spotted me immediately. Well, Jake called out, flicking his cigarette in my direction. If it isn't our little friend. I attempted to continue walking, but they surrounded me, blocking the path back to the street. My heart pounded, but I maintained a neutral expression. If my theory was correct, if Marcus truly was watching over our neighborhood. You look scared, Brett observed, grinning in that cruel way that made my skin crawl. Maybe we should walk you home, make sure you're safe. They began to close in, and I genuinely started to panic. What if I was wrong? What if Marcus truly was a predator, and I had just put myself in danger to prove some foolish point? What if he wasn't even watching, wasn't even aware I was here? Yeah, Tyler agreed, pulling out his phone again. We should definitely make sure you get home safe. Wouldn't want anything bad to happen to you. The way he spoke made it clear that bad things were precisely what he had in mind. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. There's my neighbor, Marcus said casually, as if we were old friends who had arranged to meet at the park. Ready to head home, Emma? Jake and his friends immediately retreated. They didn't flee this time, but they moved away from me, suddenly engrossed in their cigarettes and phones. Yeah, I managed, my voice only slightly trembling. Ready. Marcus walked beside me in comfortable silence until we reached the edge of the park. Then he stopped. That was reckless, he said quietly, without looking at me. You put yourself in danger to see if I'd show up. I stared at him in shock. How did you? I know what it looks like when someone's testing boundaries, he said, finally meeting my eyes. I've seen it before. Don't do it again. Those boys are more dangerous than you realize. How did you know I was there? I didn't. I was walking to the store and heard voices, recognized yours. He began to walk away, then turned back. And Emma, next time you want to know something about me, just ask. Don't put yourself at risk for answers. That night, I lay in bed, pondering his words. How had he known I was testing him? And why did he seem more concerned about my safety than angry about being watched? I resolved to follow his advice. The next Saturday, I found him in his garden and approached the fence separating our yards. He looked up from weeding his tomato plants, surprised but not unwelcoming. You said I could ask, I stated, gripping the chain-link fence between us. He set down his small shovel and gave me his full attention. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't merely sad. They were haunted, like someone who had witnessed things he wished he could erase. Why does everyone think you hurt children? His face remained perfectly still for a long moment. He didn't respond. I could hear birds chirping, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the distant hum of a lawnmower. Then he sighed deeply, as if releasing a breath he had held for years. Because I did hurt someone, he finally said. Just not in the way people imagine. Before I could inquire further, my mother's voice cut across the yard like a whip. Emma Marie Johnson, get away from that fence right now. She stood on our porch, phone in hand, looking ready to dial 911. I began. Inside now. The tone of her voice indicated this was not up for debate. That evening, my mother sat me down for the most serious conversation of my life. She had contacted Pastor Williams, who had then called someone at the police station, who had reminded her of Marcus's parole restrictions. Apparently, speaking to minors was a violation that could send him back to prison. "Do you understand what you've done?" Mom asked, her voice thick with worry and anger. "You could have sent him back to prison, and worse, you could have put yourself in terrible danger." "But he didn't do anything wrong," I protested. "He just answered my question." "That's not the point," Mom said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "The point is that you deliberately disobeyed me. You put yourself at risk. You interfered with a convicted criminal's parole." I wanted to tell her about the bullies, about how Marcus had never made me feel unsafe, about all the subtle indicators that he was protecting rather than preying. But I could see the fear in her eyes was genuine, and arguing would only exacerbate the situation. "Promise me," she said, gripping my shoulders. "Promise me you'll stay away from him. No more watching, no more questions, no more contact of any kind." I promised, but I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's words. He had hurt someone, but not in the way people thought. What could that possibly mean? Late that Thursday night, I heard shouting from Marcus's yard. I peered through my curtains and saw 3 men surrounding him on his front lawn. They were all larger than Marcus, dressed in dark clothing, their faces contorted with rage. "We know what you did," one of them yelled, shoving Marcus backward. "We know why you were in prison, you sick freak. Kids aren't safe with you around." Another shouted, pushing him from a different direction. Marcus stumbled but did not retaliate, did not even raise his hands to defend himself. "Maybe we should take care of this problem ourselves," the third one said, and something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. "Save the taxpayers some money." Marcus simply stood there, hands at his sides, enduring every insult and threat. He never raised his voice, never fought back, never even attempted to defend himself. "I understand why you're angry," he said quietly, his voice calm despite being encircled by 3 men who clearly intended him harm. "I understand why you don't want me here." "Then leave," the first man spat. "Get out of our neighborhood before something bad happens to you." "We've got kids," another added. "We're not going to stand by and let some child molester live next door to our families." That's when Marcus looked up, directly at my window. Our eyes met for just a second, and I saw something I hadn't anticipated. Not guilt, or anger, or fear, but profound exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying a burden for too long. "I've never harmed a child," he said, still looking at my window. "I never would." "Yeah, right," one of the men scoffed. "That's what they all say." The men eventually departed, but not before making it clear they would be watching him. I remained at my window, watching Marcus stand alone in his yard for nearly an hour. Finally, he went inside, and I saw his kitchen light remain on until dawn. The next morning, a note was taped to our mailbox, written in careful, neat handwriting. It read, "Check the news archives, March 15th, 2018. The real story." I waited until my mother left for her Saturday errands, then rode my bike to the public library downtown. The reference librarian, Mrs. Martinez, assisted me in accessing the newspaper archives on one of the computers. My hands trembled as I typed in the date Marcus had specified, March 15th, 2018. There it was, buried on page 3 of the local section, with a headline that made my heart stop. "Local man sentenced for assault on registered sex offender." My stomach lurched as I read the first paragraph. The article wasn't about Marcus being dangerous. It was about him being arrested for attacking someone else, someone who was the actual predator. According to the report, Marcus Torres had discovered that his neighbor, David Kellerman, was sexually abusing multiple children in their neighborhood. The article was sparse on details, but it painted a picture entirely different from what everyone in our current neighborhood believed. Marcus had been living in a different part of town 3 years prior. He had noticed unsettling patterns around Kellerman's house. Children entering happy and emerging distressed, parents dropping kids off for tutoring sessions that seemed to leave the children traumatized, a pattern of behavioral changes in neighborhood kids that deeply concerned him. When police failed to act on Marcus's reports, he had confronted Kellerman directly. The confrontation turned violent, and Marcus was arrested for assault and battery. But buried deeper in the article was a quote from Detective Sarah Mills that altered everything. While Mr. Torres's actions were legally wrong, his persistence in reporting suspected abuse likely prevented further victimization. Several children have since come forward with allegations against Mr. Kellerman, who is now facing multiple felony charges. I continued reading, my hands trembling as I scrolled through related articles. David Kellerman had been living in Marcus's old neighborhood for over a decade. He had been a respected community member, ran a youth group at the local community center, offered free babysitting services to struggling single parents, hosted sleepovers and camping trips for underprivileged children, all while systematically abusing them. The very pattern Marcus had recognized and attempted to halt. I found follow-up articles from the weeks and months that followed. 17 children eventually came forward with testimony about abuse that had been ongoing for years. David Kellerman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Marcus Torres, the man who had sacrificed his freedom to stop a monster, was branded a violent criminal by everyone who had only heard a fragment of the story. I printed every article I could find and stuffed them into my backpack. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Marcus had been the first person to report David Kellerman to authorities. When his initial reports were dismissed as the complaints of a paranoid neighbor, he had begun documenting evidence. He had taken photos of children leaving Kellerman's house looking upset, recorded license plates of parents who dropped kids off for tutoring sessions, even followed Kellerman to public places to document his interactions with children. For months, Marcus had attempted to build a case through proper channels. He had contacted police, Child Protective Services, the school district, even the FBI field office. Everyone told him the same thing. Suspicion wasn't evidence, and they needed more than one man's accusations to launch an investigation. So Marcus decided to obtain the evidence himself. According to court records I found in the library's legal database, Marcus had confronted Kellerman directly, demanding he cease abusing children. When Kellerman laughed and threatened to have Marcus arrested for harassment, something in Marcus snapped. The altercation sent Kellerman to the hospital with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a shattered wrist. It sent Marcus to prison for 3 years on assault charges. But it also opened the floodgates for Kellerman's victims to come forward. Within weeks of Kellerman's hospitalization, children began telling their parents what had been happening during those tutoring sessions and camping trips. The investigation expanded rapidly as more victims were identified, more evidence was collected, more charges were filed. By the time Marcus was sentenced, David Kellerman was facing 17 counts of child sexual abuse, 43 counts of child pornography possession, and multiple counts of child endangerment. Marcus had been correct about everything, and everyone had punished him for it. I sat in that library chair, staring at the computer screen, feeling sick about everything our neighborhood had misunderstood. Every adult in our current community had failed to uncover the truth about the man living among us. We had labeled him a dangerous predator, while ignoring the fact that he had actually sacrificed everything to protect children from a true monster. I gathered my printouts and rode home, my mind racing with questions and guilt. How many other people had misinterpreted the story? How many neighborhoods had Marcus been compelled to leave due to false assumptions? How long had he been bearing the burden of being labeled as the very thing he had fought against? When I arrived home, my mother was waiting in the kitchen, and I could tell from her expression that she knew I had been somewhere I shouldn't have been. "Where were you?" she demanded, crossing her arms. Instead of offering excuses, I spread the articles across our kitchen table and watched her face transform as she read. Her hands began to tremble by the second paragraph. "Oh my God," she whispered after finishing the first article. "We got it all wrong. We all got it completely wrong." She read every article twice, then sank heavily into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "That man," she said, her voice breaking, "that man went to prison for trying to protect children, and we treated him like a monster." "Mom, there's more," I said, pulling out the articles about David Kellerman's sentencing. "Look at what he was trying to stop." As she read about the 17 victims, about years of systematic abuse, about a predator who had exploited community trust to access vulnerable children, I watched my mother's worldview fracture and reconfigure itself. "How did we get it so wrong?" she asked, tears beginning to fall. "How did we completely miss the truth?" "Because everyone only heard part of the story," I said, and the part they heard made Marcus sound like the bad guy. That evening, my mother did something I had never witnessed before. She walked across the yard and knocked on Marcus's door. I watched from the window as she handed him the printed articles and spoke quietly for several minutes. Marcus listened without interruption, nodded a few times, then gently closed the door. When she returned inside, her eyes were red from crying. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I apologized," she said simply. "And I told him I was ashamed of how we treated him." "What did he say?" "That he understood why we were scared, that he didn't blame us for wanting to protect our children." The next few days were tumultuous in our neighborhood. My mother began calling other parents, sharing what we had learned. Some refused to believe it. Surely the newspapers had aired. Surely there was more to the story. But others began to harbor the same doubts I had experienced, the same persistent feeling that something hadn't added up. Mrs. Henderson was the most difficult to sway. She had been the most vocal about wanting Marcus removed from the neighborhood, had organized the safety patrols and emergency homeowners meetings. "This is all very convenient," she said when Mom showed her the articles. "How do we know these aren't fake? How do we know he didn't plant them somehow?" But when Pastor Williams confirmed the story by contacting his connections in Marcus's former neighborhood, even Mrs. Henderson had to accept the truth. Within a week, police cars appeared on our street, not to arrest Marcus, but to investigate the house 2 doors down from ours, David Kellerman's old house, where Dr. Richard Brennan now resided. The same Dr. Brennan who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, shortly after Marcus's release from prison. The same Dr. Brennan who had positioned himself as a child safety expert, hosting community workshops about protecting children from predators. The same Dr. Brennan who had initiated an after-school tutoring program that met at his house twice a week. The same Dr. Brennan who had volunteered to counsel children traumatized by news of the Kellerman case. And the same Dr. Brennan who had been corresponding with David Kellerman in prison, continuing the work his mentor had started. When police raided Dr. Brennan's house, they uncovered evidence that sickened even hardened investigators. Hundreds of images and videos, documentation of ongoing abuse involving at least 12 children from our neighborhood, including my friend Jenny, who had been tutoring there twice a week for the past year. That's when everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus hadn't merely been avoiding children to shield himself from false accusations. He had been observing Dr. Brennan. All those times I had seen him looking toward that house, all those strategic positions in his garden, all those careful routines, he had been gathering evidence again. But this time, he had been more astute. This time, he had learned from his past errors. Instead of confronting the predator directly, he had been meticulously documenting everything, building an airtight case, waiting for the opportune moment to present evidence that could not be dismissed or ignored. The manila envelope Detective Mills collected from Marcus contained 3 years of careful documentation. Photos taken with a telephoto lens showing children entering and leaving Dr. Brennan's house, license plate numbers of parents who dropped kids off for tutoring, behavioral observations of children before and after their sessions. Even recordings of conversations between Dr. Brennan and David Kellerman made during prison visits that Marcus had somehow documented. He's been working on this case for 3 years, Detective Mills informed the gathered crowd of parents and reporters. Mr. Torres provided the key evidence that allowed us to build a prosecution case. The night Dr. Brennan was arrested, I found Marcus standing in his backyard, gazing at the police cars surrounding the house 2 doors down. I walked over, ignoring my mother's worried calls from our porch. "You knew?" I asked. "This whole time you knew he was harming children?" Marcus looked at me with those same weary eyes I had been seeing for months. "I suspected from the day he moved in. Kellerman had mentioned him in letters. I knew he was coming. Why didn't you report him immediately?" "I did, multiple times. But I'm a convicted felon reporting on a respected psychiatrist. Who do you think they believe?" The weight of his words struck me like a physical blow. He had been trying to protect us for 3 years, and no one had listened because of his criminal record. "So you just watched?" "I watched. I documented. I gathered evidence that couldn't be dismissed. And I tried to keep kids safe without being able to save them." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea what that's like? Knowing children are being hurt and being powerless to stop it immediately." Detective Mills approached us, her expression respectful. "Mr. Torres, we're going to need your full statement, and we'll need to go through all your documentation." Marcus nodded and handed her a thick manila envelope. "Everything's organized by date. Photos, behavioral observations, correspondence records, even financial transactions that seemed suspicious." "This is incredible work," Detective Mills said, flipping through the materials. "You basically did our job for us." "I had 3 years of practice," Marcus replied quietly. Over the following weeks, our neighborhood underwent a complete transformation. Parents who had once crossed the street to avoid Marcus now brought him homemade goods and tearful apologies. Children who had been taught to fear him learned he had been the guardian angel they never knew they had. Mrs. Henderson organized what she called an apology campaign, neighbors taking turns visiting Marcus to express their regret for how they had treated him. She was the first in line. "I ruined your life," she sobbed on his front porch. "I organized the whole neighborhood against you. I made everyone afraid. You were protecting your grandchildren," Marcus told her gently. "I can't fault you for that." But Marcus never displayed anger or bitterness, even when people offered elaborate apologies and explanations. When neighbors attempted to organize a fundraiser to assist him, he declined. When they offered public recognition, he refused. When the local news wished to feature a story about the man who had solved the case, he said, "No interviews. I didn't do this for recognition," he told the persistent reporter. "I did it because children deserve to be safe." The community tried everything to make amends. The Homeowners Association voted to bestow upon him a special recognition award. The city council desired to present him with a key to the city. Parents offered to pay for home improvements, car repairs, anything he required. Marcus politely declined everything. "I don't need recognition," he told my mother when she inquired what the neighborhood could do to atone for their treatment. "I just need to know kids are safe." 3 months after Dr. Brennan's arrest, Marcus put his house up for sale, not because of continued harassment that had ceased entirely, not because people still feared him. They had shifted to the opposite extreme of treating him like a hero, but because he had finally discovered something he had been seeking since his release from prison 3 years earlier: peace. He had spent years carrying the burden of being labeled as the very thing he had fought against. He had endured harassment, isolation, and constant suspicion while quietly working to protect the children who feared him. Now, finally, the truth was known. The real monster had been apprehended. The neighborhood was secure. His work was complete. The day before he moved out, Marcus left me a note. "Emma, thank you for being brave enough to seek the truth when all the adults around you had stopped trying. You saw things they missed, asked questions they were afraid to ask, and refused to accept easy answers to complicated questions. Keep questioning what people tell you, especially when something doesn't feel right. The most important truths are often the ones that make people uncomfortable. You have good instincts. Trust them. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore what you see with your own eyes or feel in your gut. And remember that the people who seem dangerous aren't always the ones you need to fear. Sometimes, they're the ones trying to save you. Stay safe, stay curious, and don't let anyone convince you to stop asking difficult questions." Marcus, P.S. I left something for you in the garden, behind the sunflowers. I found a small metal lockbox buried where he had indicated. Inside was a key and a note. For your bike lock. Kids should be able to ride safely without worrying about bullies or worse. There was also a photograph. Marcus in military uniform, much younger, standing with a group of soldiers in front of what appeared to be a Middle Eastern building. On the back, he had written, "Afghanistan 2009. Military police. Sometimes protecting people means making sacrifices others don't understand." I learned later that Marcus had been a military police officer overseas, specializing in investigating abuse cases involving contractors and local officials. He had been decorated twice for his work protecting civilians, including children, in war zones. He had essentially been performing the same job his entire adult life, safeguarding vulnerable people from predators. The house where Dr. Brennan had lived was demolished within 6 months, the property deemed too contaminated by what had transpired there. In its place, the city constructed a small park with a playground and a community garden. There's a bench near the swings with a small plaque that reads, "In memory of courage." For those who speak up when no one wants to listen. I sit on that bench sometimes and reflect on Marcus, about how he had spent 3 years in prison and another 3 years in neighborhood exile, all for attempting to protect children. About how many children might have been saved if we had listened to him from the beginning instead of believing assumptions and gossip. About how he had continued protecting us even when everyone thought he was the danger. Now I'm 25, working as a social worker specializing in child protection cases. My colleagues all know the story of Marcus Torres, how a man everyone feared turned out to be the guardian angel our neighborhood desperately needed. It has reshaped how I approach every case, how I listen to every report, how I investigate every claim. I've learned to look beyond superficial accusations and delve for the complete truth, even when that truth is unsettling or complex. I've also learned to pay attention to the individuals others dismiss. The witnesses deemed unreliable because of their criminal records, the reporters whose past makes people uncomfortable, the advocates who ask difficult questions that make institutions defensive. Because sometimes, the person everyone warns you about is the only one speaking the truth. Sometimes, the real monster is concealed behind community respect, professional credentials, and a friendly smile. And sometimes, protection emanates from the most improbable places, from someone who has already lost everything but still refuses to cease caring. Marcus taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what is right, even when the world punishes you for it, even when no one believes you, even when helping others costs you everything. Last month, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a child trafficking ring that had been exposed in another state, and a note in familiar handwriting. Some fights never end, but they're always worth fighting. Stay safe. Keep asking questions. A friend. I don't know if Marcus was involved in that investigation, but I hope he was. I hope he's somewhere out there, still watching out for children who need protection, still making sacrifices that others will never understand or appreciate. Because the world needs more people like Marcus Torres. People who perceive dangers others miss. People who act when institutions fail. People who sacrifice their reputation, their freedom, even their safety to protect the innocent. People who comprehend that sometimes, being the person everyone warns you about is precisely what is required.